I am 73 years old. It was a Sunday afternoon late last October, and Derek had come over to watch a football game in the living room. I was sitting in my old brown leather recliner, the one I have had for 15 years. When the fourth quarter ended, Derek stood up to take his empty plate into the kitchen. I pushed the lever to lower the footrest, planted my boots on the carpet, and tried to stand up. The exact second my weight shifted forward onto my right knee, a sickening, sharp, grinding sensation tore through the joint. It felt like someone had driven a hot wedge of iron directly beneath my kneecap. The pain took my breath away. My leg simply refused to straighten. I collapsed heavily back into the deep cushion of the recliner, gripping the wooden armrest so hard my knuckles turned white. Derek turned around from the hallway, pretending he was just checking the television screen, but I saw the look on his face. He knew I was trapped in my own chair. I sat there waiting for the burning to subside, feeling a quiet, heavy shame settle in my chest. I spent 30 years working on the concrete floors of a regional distribution center. I carried freight, I climbed steel ladders, and I used my legs like heavy industrial machinery. When you live that kind of life, you just accept that joint pain is the final bill coming due. You listen to the doctors tell you that your cartilage is gone, that it is just bone rubbing on bone, and that there's absolutely nothing you can do about it except sit down and take pain pills. Sitting in that recliner, rubbing the swollen skin around my kneecap, I believed them. I thought my days of walking the yard or working in the garage were permanently over. I was accepting the decline. My daughter Megan came over the following Tuesday. She is an occupational therapist, and she spends her entire week working with older men and women who have surrendered their independence because they think their bodies are broken beyond repair. She saw me limping heavily as I walked from the kitchen to the dining table. I made the mistake of telling her that my knees were just shot from the warehouse days and that I just needed to stay off them. She did not give me any sympathy. She sat down across from me and told me about a massive medical paper she had been reading at her clinic. It tracked men in their late 60s and 70s who had been diagnosed with severe bone-on-bone knee arthritis. The data was absolutely staggering. It showed that over 80% of the pain those men felt was not actually coming from the bones. It was coming from the fact that the muscle scaffolding around the knee had completely shut down. We let our legs get weak, the shock absorbers rust away, and the joint takes every single ounce of the impact. I spent the next 2 weeks looking at my own legs like a diagnostic project in my garage. I realized that my daily routine of sitting in the house and avoiding movement to protect my knees was actively destroying whatever support they had left. I knew I had to rebuild the scaffolding, but I could not use heavy weights, and I could not do the things younger men do in a gym. My joints could not handle the impact. I narrowed my recovery down to 5 incredibly specific, quiet movements. I call them lazy movements because you do not even have to stand up to do them. You do them sitting in a chair or lying in bed. I'm going to tell you exactly what all 5 of these movements are. The first 4 stop the grinding and put the brakes on the damage, but you need to pay close attention to the 5th movement. That last one is the specific action that completely reversed the deep pain and gave me my life back. The first movement I had to start doing was meant to fix a massive mistake I was making every time I sat in that recliner. When you sit with your knees bent for hours, the large muscle on the front of your thigh completely goes to sleep. It forgets how to hold tension. I had to wake it up without bending the joint and causing that sharp pain. I started doing a static bed press. Before I even got out of bed in the morning, I would take a thick, rolled-up towel and place it directly under my right knee. Then, lying flat on my back, I would push the back of my knee down into that towel as hard as I possibly could, forcing the muscle on the top of my thigh to contract like a clenched fist. I held that squeeze for 10 full seconds. I was not lifting any weight. I was just forcing the muscle to remember how to fire and protect the joint. Megan showed me a clinical study that looked at older adults doing these static isometric holds versus people trying to walk off their knee pain. The group doing the static bed holds reduced the shear force on their knee joints by over 40% in just 6 weeks. By forcing that thigh muscle to tighten and hold, they were literally building a thick protective cable that pulled the kneecap back into its proper track before they ever stood up. It made me think of my old neighbor, Arthur. Arthur is 76, and he stopped walking his dog last year because his left knee felt loose, like it was going to buckle backward. He bought a heavy medical brace and just accepted the limp. He thought the joint was destroyed. What he did not know was that his thigh muscle had just vanished. His knee was buckling because there was nothing holding it together. I started doing those towel presses every single morning in the dark, rebuilding that front cable before my feet ever hit the floor. Once I got the front of the leg firing again, I realized I was completely ignoring the back of the leg. The second movement I had to add was the heel drag. When you drive a lot or sit in a recliner, the muscles on the back of your thighs get incredibly weak and overstretched. Your knee joint is held in balance by the muscles on the front pulling one way and the muscles on the back pulling the other. If the back is weak, the knee gets pulled entirely out of alignment every time you take a step. I stayed right there in the bed to fix it. I would lie flat, bend my knee just slightly, and dig my heel deep into the mattress. Then, without actually moving my foot, I would pull backward with my heel, dragging against the friction of the heavy blankets. I held that pulling tension for 5 seconds, feeling the back of my leg cramp up. I was using my own bed as the resistance. I read a paper from a university that tracked men over 65 who had severe knee collapses. The researchers found that a massive imbalance between the front and back of the leg was the primary cause of sudden joint failure in older men. The men who rebuilt their hamstring strength saw a dramatic drop in daily pain because the knee was finally being supported equally from both sides. My brother-in-law, Robert, suffered from this exact imbalance. He spent 40 years driving a delivery truck. Last winter, he stepped off a curb. His hamstring failed to catch the momentum, and his knee hyperextended so badly he had to wear a cast for 2 months. I made sure I did my heel drags every single morning, building the breaks my legs desperately needed. The third movement forced me to address the inside of my legs, a place most men never think about. As we get older, we tend to walk with a wider stance to keep our balance. When you do that, the muscle on the inside of your thigh, right above the knee in the shape of a teardrop, completely wastes away. When that specific muscle gets weak, your kneecap gets pulled to the outside of your leg every time you bend it. That tracking error grinds the cartilage down to nothing. I fixed this while sitting at the kitchen table drinking my coffee. I took a firm throw pillow from the sofa, placed it between my knees, and squeezed my legs together as hard as I could. I held that crushing pressure for 10 seconds at a time. I was not moving the joint, I was just activating the inner thigh. I read a study that looked specifically at older men with medial knee pain. The researchers discovered that inner thigh weakness was the #1 predictor of whether an older man would suffer from a misaligned kneecap. The men who strengthened that specific teardrop muscle forced their kneecaps to slide perfectly straight in the groove, taking the grinding pressure off the bone. My friend Michael from church had this exact problem. You could hear his knees popping and cracking every time he stood up from the pew. He eventually needed surgery on both legs because he wore the cartilage down to the bone from bad tracking. I did my pillow squeezes every morning at the table, building the guy wires that kept my kneecaps stepping straight and true. The fourth movement forced me to look away from the knee itself and look down at my ankles. When an older man walks, his ankles get incredibly stiff. We shuffle. We stop rolling through our feet. When your ankle loses its ability to bend and absorb the shock of the ground, that impact does not just disappear. It travels straight up the heavy shin bone and slams directly into the bottom of the knee joint. I was hammering my own knees with every single step I took because my ankles were locked solid. I stayed right in the kitchen chair to solve it. I extended my legs out straight and started doing slow, exaggerated ankle circles and toe pumps. I would pull my toes back toward my shins as far as they would go, hold the stretch, and then point them away like I was pressing a heavy gas pedal. It sounds ridiculously simple, but I found a research trial that compared older men with stiff ankles to men with mobile ankles. The men who restored their ankle mobility reduced the impact load on their knees by 30% with every single step. They were giving their body its natural shock absorbers back. A guy I used to work with named Thomas completely lost his ankle mobility after a minor foot surgery. Within a year, his knees were in such agony he could barely walk the aisles at the grocery store. The shock was destroying his joints from the bottom up. I did my ankle pumps every afternoon, making sure my knees never had to take that kind of blunt force beating again. Doing those 4 lazy movements stopped the sharp, tearing pains. My knees felt significantly more stable when I walked from the kitchen to the bedroom. The deep, hot ache at night started to fade away, but I still did not trust the joint. I still felt a lingering weakness right below the kneecap when I tried to stand up from a deep chair. I had stopped the bleeding, but I had not rebuilt the engine. I had to do the 5th movement. The biggest lie we are told about bad knees is that we should rest them completely. We are told to keep our legs entirely still to protect the tendons. But keeping the joint perfectly still is exactly what starves the tendons of the blood flow they desperately need to heal. Tendons do not have a heavy blood supply like muscles do. You have to force the blood into them. I stayed in my kitchen chair. I planted my boots flat on the linoleum floor. Instead of trying to stand up, I kept my weight in the chair and tried to drag my boots backward across the floor, pulling with everything I had. The friction of the floor stopped my feet from actually moving, but the intense isometric pulling forced the muscles around the knee to engage in a completely different way. I was acting as my own immovable resistance. I read a staggering study from a sports medicine journal that tracked men in their 70s who performed these isometric backward pulls. The reverse tension forced the body to pump massive amounts of fresh, oxygen-rich blood directly into the patellar tendon, the thick band of tissue right below the kneecap that usually causes all the pain when you stand up. The men in the study completely reversed decades of tendon degeneration. They were actively healing the dead tissue by forcing the blood to go where it usually cannot reach. I sat in that chair and pulled backward against the floor for 20 seconds at a time. I rested and I did it again. I did it every single morning. I focused entirely on the feeling of the tension pushing into the front of my legs, repairing the microscopic damage I thought was completely permanent. The change was not a sudden miracle. You do not undo years of neglect in a single weekend. But about 2 months after I started doing those 5 lazy movements every day, I was sitting in that same brown leather recliner in the living room. Derek was over again. I pushed the lever, lowered the footrest, planted my boots on the carpet, and stood up. I did not grab the wooden armrests. I did not brace my back. My thigh simply fired, the joint held perfectly smooth, and I stood straight up without a single pop, grind, or flash of pain. Derek looked at me from the sofa. He had seen me trapped in that chair 2 months earlier. I stood there holding my own weight, feeling the solid floor under my boots, and I realized my knees were completely quiet. There was no grinding. There was no sharp heat. There was just the strong, quiet tension of muscles doing exactly what they were designed to do. When you get to be my age, the things that matter are incredibly simple. I want to be able to get out of a chair without wondering if my legs are going to buckle. I want to be able to walk across the room without bracing myself against the walls. You do not have to accept the pain. You do not have to believe that the grinding in your joints is a life sentence. Muscle does not vanish because the calendar turns over, and joints do not have to remain broken. If you rebuild the scaffolding from the comfort of your own chair, if you feed the tendons, and if you demand that your body do the work, the strength will absolutely return. I am going to head out to the garage now. Linda asked me to move some heavy boxes of holiday decorations off the bottom shelf, and I need to go bend down and pick them up. Take care of your legs, put the quiet work in, and do not let anyone tell you that your independence is over. I will be right here if you want to talk again.